Very well known to those of you that may live in this area, but also he is a man who has made a name for himself in the world of astrology for nearly 20 years. And we have, of course, discussed astrology here before, but it's something which does not receive the respect that it deserves in the mainstream. And yet, when you look at the very serious research that's going on into the astrological cycles and how they affect us today and where we are going in our society, of course, you begin to realize there is much more to the story. This is what we're going to hear today from John, is where are we going in the next few years, how, astrologically speaking, are things going to pan out. So this is very exciting. So please give a big round of applause to John Wadsworth.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be invited to come and talk at this conference, which I know has been going for a long time. I know a lot of you have come a long way to be here this weekend. I've had to walk 200 yards. I live just up the road. And living in Glastonbury, what an incredible place to be over this time. I feel very blessed, really, to be able to experience being in this extraordinary hub, really, of transformation at such a transformational time in history. I'm a professional astrologer. I've been working as an astrologer for about 20 years, and since my early 20s. My whole world was turned on its head when I was 21, when I discovered this art. It changed the entire course of my life. In fact, I was telling somebody earlier on, in one night, an epiphany. I had an epiphany under a night sky when I was 21 years old in Spain. And suddenly this understanding of the relationship between the sky, the earth, the human being, all of life, how interconnected it is. It had never even occurred to me before that might be the case. And suddenly this realization came through me. And it really began my passion and my journey as an astrologer. And it's all I could do, really. It's the only thing I've ever been able to... has kept me interested, I think, throughout my life ever since. And I think it keeps me interested because it is so deep and multi-layered. It so speaks to the imagination. It speaks to that part of us which needs guidance, which looks for signs, which looks for that deep knowing that we all have, that we're all connected, that everything in life is somehow connected, and that I like to think of it as the way that our imagination penetrates the heavens and how the heavens penetrate our imagination. And somehow in that interweave, we come together and we realize who we are and we realize our place in the cosmos. So we are, of course, living in extraordinary times. It's been said many times, that expression. And it's impossible to talk about astrology these days without referring to this. I'm not going to talk about it. It's not the theme of my talk, but it has to be in here, of course. We all want to know what's going to happen, how the world is going to unfold, what's going to happen in the future. And so many of us sense that this time that we're now living through is like no other time. And how compelling to have an ancient artifact actually pinpointing a date. We all know the 21st of December 2012. I'm not going to really go into it, except just to show you this. Many of you will have seen this. Somehow the Mayans knew where the center of the galaxy was. We can wonder at how they might have been able to know that, because it's only in recent years that scientists have confirmed where it is. It's more or less where that little square is. And how beautiful that ancient astrology should actually point to the spot precisely. If you follow the arrow, so many of you will know this, but if you follow the arrow of Sagittarius from his bow, and you follow the sting on the tail of the scorpion, that is the spot, that is the center of the galaxy, marked out for us beautifully so that we can rediscover that. The Mayans already knew, though, and this is of course, the alignment of the sun, on the ecliptic path with the center of the galaxy, the galactic plane. It's more accurate to say that the winter solstice sun conjuncts the galactic plane rather than the galactic center, but of course you can see how close it is to the galactic center there. But it's not the theme of my talk, but it just kind of has to be in there as, I think, because everything else that we are considering somehow pivots around this moment in time. We have our own system in the West that we call the astrological ages, also derived from the precession of the equinoxes, which is the same phenomena which moves very gradually the winter solstice sun, so that it's in the point where it is now. The spring equinox, point of the vernal equinox, the rising sun, dawn on the spring equinox, is marked out, and this is what gives us our astrological ages. And here we have Jung's ingenious depiction. Carl Jung produced this in his book Aeon, and it marks out key events tied to the vernal equinox meeting the stars in the constellation of Pisces. I don't know if you can see the numbers at the bottom, if you can see the dates, but you might notice that actually we're somewhere in the middle of the fish, but by no means at the end of it. And you can see that Jung's date actually for that last star on Pisces is 3,110. Sorry, that's a bit depressing, isn't it? But there we are. There we are. It's if we're going to take the actual physical alignment with the constellation of the stars, we seem to be in Pisces for quite a while longer. But it is interesting if we look at the date 1817, and this is very close to a date which I'm going to put forward as being important later in the talk, that this was the moment where the vernal equinox touched the star that marks the last tie on the back of that fish. So we've come, and the knot, the star Alresha, was more or less around the time of the birth of Christ, and this is often associated as the beginning of the age of Pisces, of course, when Christ was born. So here's the winter solstice sun for this year. It's going to be virtually exactly the same next year. And here it is, clearly there on the fish. There's Aquarius coming in there. If we go back to year 0, there we see it with at the base of the fish. That's pretty good, isn't it? That's right, really bang on. That's the birth of Christ, of course. And then if we go 1,000 years in, we're definitely in Aquarius in 1,000 years' time. But opinions differ on when we change ages. So many of us, including myself actually, sense that this time that we're living through represents symbolically that shift into Aquarius. And there are many ways of working it out. We can divide that 26,000-year cycle into 12, and then we're more or less in the area. It's only because Pisces is such a large constellation, takes up so much of the ecliptic, that it actually seems to want to last longer than some of the other ages. So some people say the age of Aquarius began with the discovery of Uranus in 1781, something I'm going to talk about. Other people say that it won't happen until the year 3000, based on what I've shown you here. But there's something compelling about this time, isn't there, that we're living through now? And I'm not going to argue for when the age of Aquarius happens. I'm not going to give a date. We haven't got a date like 2012 to work with as astrologers, but we have our intuition, we have our sense of these times that we're living through. So astrology is a study of cycles, and it's these cycles that I'm interested in, the cycles I'm going to talk about as I take you through. What I hope to show is that in the last 300 years, or the last 250 years, since the discovery of Uranus and the outer planets, how they've come to reflect and represent a shift in our consciousness, as if we've had to take on a whole other way of seeing and perceiving. And that's really coming home to roost now at this time, as to how we integrate this knowledge. So here's what's known as the Ptolemaic cosmos. This is the geocentric, Earth-based cosmos with the 7 planets. We've got the cycle of the 7 planets around. We've got the zodiac signs here, and it's a complete system. Saturn, the furthest planet that you can see with the naked eye, represents the limit of this cosmos. You can't go beyond Saturn. It's the limit of this cosmos. And each of these planets represents an archetype, represents an aspect of life. And if you put all the planets together and you combine them with the signs, you get a completeness and a totality. And astrology is based on this completeness. And before 1781, this was the completeness. In fact, it's slightly earlier, as I'll say, but for thousands of years we could assume or suppose those 7 wanderers, that's what the word planet means, it means wanderer, those 7 wanderers through the night sky, they were the only objects in the sky that moved in relation to the cloth of the fixed stars behind it. And they came to represent not just as physical objects, not just as what we now think of, to our modern mind, we think of a planet as a physical object because we've been able to get so close to them and see them, and scientists are interested now in their makeup, what makes a planet up, and its composition, its geology, and so on. A planet didn't mean that in the pre-Enlightenment world. A planet meant so much more than that. And to the astrologer, of course, a planet does mean so much more than that. A planet is a god. We find the planets in everyday life. We find them represented symbolically, metaphorically, in everything we meet in life. Everything that we encounter in the world can be expressed astrologically and understood astrologically. And this is really the basis, the foundation of the Ptolemaic worldview. It's how we see when we look. It's where we look from our position on the earth. Astrology remains unashamedly geocentric. It's about how it appears. Astrology is about the way things seem, the way things look, the way things appear to us. And the correspondences, the synchronicities that we encounter, our way of making sense of the world, is all about that law of correspondence and that law of resemblance, the way that things look. And we can see this in medieval medicine as well. You know, we can see it if we look at we understand that a walnut is good for the brain. It looks like a brain. We understand that tomatoes are good for the heart. You cut them in half, they look like a heart. And so on. You know, this somehow in the magic and the poetry of the cosmos, the way that how something appears to us also gives us a clue as to its meaning. So Mars as the red planet comes to represent anger and passion. Venus as the beautiful blue planet becomes to represent love, beauty, and so on. Mercury as the will-o'-the-wisp that appears only for a few minutes, if you're lucky, near the sun, becomes the messenger of the gods, the one moving between the worlds. And so the way that the planets appear and the stars appear to us comes to inform us of their meaning. And it's always been that way. And I just want to show this beautiful order that you get when you only work with the planets out to Saturn. These are the rulerships of the planets of the sun, over the signs. So you have the sun ruling Leo, moon ruling Cancer, and then you just go around and you pan out, and here you have the Mercury rulerships, the Venus rulerships, the Mars rulerships, the Jupiter rulerships, the Saturn rulerships. A perfect symmetry. And it gives us this, what I call, and what has been called, the ensouled cosmos, a completeness. And to the naked eye, before we start working with telescopes, it is all that we have. And Jupiter and Saturn, the 2 outermost planets within the traditional system, come to represent the 2 most important cycles. One about just under 12 years, one just under 30 years. We're all familiar with the Saturn return. I'm sure we all have memories of it. We may have had one, we may have had 2, but it probably sits in our memory if we think back and go, oh yes, I remember that when I was 29, and how different life seemed in your 30s than it did in your 20s. When you're about 60, around the time of the Saturn return, they come together. The 5th Jupiter return corresponds with the 2nd Saturn return. So you get them both together. And that would have been such an important marker, and still is, of course, but these cycles had so much significance in the ancient world and in the pre-modern world, if we call it that. And when they came together into conjunction, that was the most important moment astrologically when these two came together. It's called the Great Conjunction, happened every 20 years. So every 20 years, these two make a conjunction. So it's a fairly regular, you might experience 2 or 3 or 4 Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions in your lifetime. And because of the 20-year gap between them, they actually remain in the same element for about 200 years. So every 200 years or so, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction will shift into a different element. And this is marked out here in a medieval drawing of these are called the trigons. So here you've got the conjunction of 1583, top left there, and then it goes across 1603 to the right, down to 1623, and so on. And it goes around, and this carries on. And here we see the conjunctions in the water signs moving into the fire signs. Now this, it seems that throughout history, Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions have marked significant cultural moments. The end of the Incan Empire is marked on a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, as is, many astrologers believe, the birth of Christ. At least the star of Bethlehem, the star in the sky, is assumed now by many to have been a Saturn-Jupiter conjunction in 7 BC. And that marked the end of, or the transition. It happened in Pisces, and it marked the transition between the water and the fire element, which is reflected here. The same thing is happening 1,600 or so years later. We're getting this transition from water into fire. So that actually marks the end of an 800-year cycle, because the cycle would begin with fire. So every 800 years, you will have gone through the whole cycle. As we see here, this is the 800-year cycle of conjunctions. This would have been hugely important and would have been seen as so by those wise men astrologers, right? They would have seen this as being a hugely significant moment. So the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction holds great significance when you've got nothing beyond it. And Saturn was said to give to Jupiter all the measures of the whole creation. So Jupiter and Saturn, when they come together, there is a kind of a handover, like a handover of power, a handover of authority, perhaps. Somehow the two of them coming together represents a kind of stability. There could be an overthrow, there could be a change in the political structure, there could be a shift in the rulership, or the culture could change very significantly in some way. And yet it remains within the bounds of the visible universe, therefore within the bounds of Saturn, the furthermost planet. And these two were known as the chronocrators. It's a medieval term. The chronocrators, the keepers of time. We associate Saturn, of course, with time, primarily. Saturn is the measurer of time, representative of the old order, the ruler, the law enforcer. And Jupiter, representing the new growth, the opportunity, the lawmaker, the new ruler. It's Jupiter who comes in to displace Saturn, as in the myth. When he castrates his father, they always castrate each other in Greek mythology, of course, so it's all a bit gruesome. But this is the way that Jupiter has to overthrow Saturn. But in some way, at some other level, there is this handover of power and authority to keep, so that youthful Jupiter energy can replace the old Saturn energy, and the cycle can carry on. And within that, everything remains relatively stable. And so we have relative stability. Culturally, spiritually, there's relative stability. That's not to say that things don't change. Of course, they change hugely, but compared to what we're seeing now, I think relative stability. As I said before, the cosmos is ensouled. This is a key aspect. We're not just dealing with physical planets, we're dealing with an ensouled cosmos. Saturn being the limit of that perception. It's a phenomenological worldview. It's the way that our own experience is everything in that sense. We're trying to understand how it all works, yes, but we're also honoring, and still do as astrologers, our own experience, our own how it comes to us from our Earth-centered, geocentric view. And it all changes, doesn't it, around the 16th, 17th century. Copernicus, who comes up with the theory of a sun-centered cosmos, confirmed with Galileo's telescope and Kepler's understanding of elliptical orbits. The theory becomes, in inverted commas, fact. This should kill astrology off, shouldn't it? That's certainly what the Enlightenment thinkers believed. And it's what modern Enlightenment influence thinkers, of course, believe. It's like, how can this anachronism of astrology still survive when we know that the sun is at the center, not the earth? But of course it does, and you're all here listening to me talk, so there's obviously still some interest in it. But really, this should have been the end, shouldn't it? The outer planets. It all changes for astrology. And symbolically, for our whole way of understanding ourselves and the world and the cosmos, with the discovery of these three outer planets. One for each century, one for the 18th century, one for the 19th century, and one for the 20th century. Three modern planets, significantly, that cannot be seen with the naked eye. You need technology, you need a telescope. And in Pluto's case, a very powerful telescope to see these planets. And each comes to represent a transpersonal collective archetype. I mentioned archetypes, the idea of each of the traditional planets representing an archetype. But we can understand that, these are beyond our perception. These are beyond, we can't see these when we look up at the night sky. They're beyond our perception. And they come to represent for us something beyond us. And each signals, reflects, symbolizes, reflects back to us, if you like, a fundamental shift in our collective consciousness, in the way that we understand, and in the whole way that we operate really as human beings. I'm not saying that they cause this, by the way. I'm just saying that they reflect this culturally. And each symbolically undermines the authority of the chronocrators, Jupiter and Saturn, especially Saturn. So let's go through them. Here's Uranus, discovered in Bath, very nearby, in 1781 by William Herschel. They were going to call it after him, Herschel originally. Then they were going to call it George IV. Can you imagine calling a planet George IV? And then they saw mythic sense. And they followed the order. They followed the mythological order. They could easily not have done, and yet something stirring maybe in the collective. It's like, whoa, hang on a minute. You're not calling the planet George IV. It's got to be called something significant, and it's got to follow the tradition. And even though these guys were Enlightenment thinkers, they were out there. They had no interest in astrology. In fact, they probably wanted to just flatten astrology and just destroy it completely. And yet they followed the order, and Uranus, the name Uranus, was given. And let's just set the context here. Uranus heralded an era marked by the emancipation of thought, the Enlightenment. This is the Enlightenment age. The Enlightenment's begun, but in a way, the discovery of Uranus kind of epitomizes it. It epitomizes that age of enlightenment. Robert Hand calls it the endarkenment, but we'll stick with the traditional term. It's a time of revolutionary social change, as we'll see. The breakthrough in astronomy, of course, in its discovery, that is the breakthrough. The fact that there are planets beyond Saturn. Hard to imagine the impact of that, how extraordinary that is now. And technological innovation. So let's have a look at Uranus. Mythologically, the god of the starry sky. This is Gaia. He was the husband of Gaia. Together they create life, they create the world. And so it's Father Sky and Mother Earth. He's a pretty unpleasant character. He's got no time. He's very aloof. He just wants to cut off all his children. He's got no interest in his children whatsoever. He's a kind of ghastly character, really, in a way. But he does represent that that starry sky, that reaching out beyond, back to the origins. And of course, as we journey out into space, first with the telescope and then later, of course, with our space probes, rockets and space probes and so on, we're journeying out in our minds of what our minds can perceive and take on. Our understanding of the universe expanding and expanding, as if we're going to go back to the origins of things. And Uranus marks really the beginning of that, symbolically, culturally. A lot of astrologers would rather Uranus was named something else, specifically Prometheus. Richard Tarnas is the great champion of this. Because Prometheus seems like such a perfect character for this planet of that comes to represent innovation, technology, the enlightenment, the new beginnings. Prometheus is the one, of course, who steals fire from the gods and gives it to humanity. Some might question the good sense of that, actually giving humanity the power of its own creativity. But this is certainly what's happening around this time more than ever before. Human beings are being given the power of their own destiny. And the technological innovations that come through, beginning with this time, really kind of represent that. But also the human mind moving beyond, wanting to break completely with the authority of the past. Prometheus represents that perfectly, really. He's the awakener of humanity in that sense. So we could see him very positively in that way, of course. He's waking us up out of our sleep. But it's also the ultimate hubris for Prometheus to steal fire, for which, of course, he's punished severely by having his liver pecked out by a vulture in the underworld, for which he's eventually saved by Chiron. A lot of you will know that story. It's not really relevant to our story particularly, but it's more the stealing of the fire, which is so relevant for Uranus. Uranus comes to represent independence and autonomy. No surprise then that the Declaration of Independence happens around this time, around the time of the discovery. The New World, America, comes into being. The USA is born around the time of Uranus' discovery. Uranus is the revolutionary. No surprise then that this is also the time of the French Revolution and other revolutions across Europe. And Uranus is all about technical innovation. This is a picture of a spinning jenny, which was discovered just a couple of years before the discovery of Uranus. Such a significant moment. So it became symbolic of the whole Industrial Revolution. So here we have the founding of the USA, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, how fundamental these events in history are. And they completely represent the energy of Uranus. Uranus' return cycle is 84 years, just beyond the expectation, certainly the traditional life expectation. We might kind of optimistically expect that we're going to live to this age now, but it would have been outside of the expectation a few hundred years ago. Just as Uranus is just that bit outside of our perceptual viewpoint. Only just, you can see it. You don't need a very strong telescope even to see Uranus, but it's just a little bit beyond it. We've had a few Uranus returns. Well, we've had more than one anyway, 2 or 3. Uranus is in Aries now, as of this year. Its entry into Aries coincided very closely with the revolutions in the Middle East, particularly in Egypt. I was lucky enough definitely, to be in Tahrir Square the night that it started. I was in Egypt, and we had no idea. We'd just come out of the metro station in Tahrir Square just as the police were running at the protesters on the night it started. Quite amazing to be there, and it's something I'll always treasure. I love this image. It really kind of captures something of it. But it's so much epitomizes Uranus in Aries, that out of the blue. Where did that come from? Impulse, fiery energy of like, we've got to change it, and we've got to change it now. There's absolutely no time to waste, and we're just going to do it. And it feels this year, since Uranus has come into Aries, that we really are charged up with that energy, carrying that energy forward. I'll say more about Uranus' position in relation to Pluto in a little while. But for now, let's go to Neptune, the second of the outer planets to be discovered. amid confusion, as you might expect with Neptune. This was confusion as to who had actually discovered it, because two people sort of discovered it simultaneously. But it's generally accredited to the Frenchman Urbain Le Verrier, who of course wanted to name it after himself. These Enlightenment guys were still carried a big ego with them, and they wanted the planets named after them. But again, somehow, mythic sense was followed, and Neptune was the name given. And really, you won't find many astrologers that have a problem with the naming of Neptune. It really seems to fit very well. The god of the sea, Poseidon in the Greek tradition, Neptune in the Roman tradition. And Neptune was the one who would throw the hero, of course, would throw Ulysses off course continually in his journey home to Ithaca. He was the nemesis of sailors, because you never knew what he was going to do next. It wasn't like the land, which you could kind of know and you could develop a relationship with. The sea was the unknown. A sea journey, and when we take a sea journey, it takes us beyond ourselves. We don't know where we're going to end up. We're at the mercy of the god Neptune. In Neptune, all the outer planets challenge the authority of Saturn. Uranus just breaks Saturn and smashes them into pieces, or tries to. Neptune dissolves Saturn's boundaries. This wonderful picture by Dali of the melted clocks is a wonderful image for Neptune, really, the dissolving of time. It's like being on drugs or being on a trip. It's that kind of, you don't know where you are. All the rules have changed. Everything is blurred. You're in another realm, which has different rules. And you have to let go of control in the face of Neptune. You can't hold on to control and expect that your plan is going to actually unfold. Neptune dissolves all those expectations of order. We touch Neptune most in sleep and in dream. Neptune anesthetizes us. It sends us to sleep. It hypnotizes us. It's very much connected with the projected image. We can see it in the development of photography and film and cinema, and the allure of those projected images, and how we can lose ourselves in the projected image and assume it to be reality. Neptune is Maya, illusion. And all the paradox within that as well. That the minute we think we've got something, the minute we think we've grasped it, Maya is there to cast her veil over it and show us that we are actually deceived. And yet in that also, if we can accept that and go with her dictate, we also can find a profound and transcendental truth. So let's look at what happens. Neptune's discovered in 1846. This is the time when yoga, meditation, Eastern philosophies are being imported to the West through colonialism and so on. The Theosophical movement begins very soon after the discovery of Neptune. There's a whole embracing of Eastern ways, of Eastern philosophies. New social and religious ideologies. Very close to the date of the discovery was the major rally on I think it was Wandsworth Common in London, which was, some say, was the birth of the Labour Party. The Labour Party begins quite soon after this. And also, of course, we have Karl Marx producing his manifesto around this time as well. So there's a whole kind of shift in an ideology, the idea of utopia, and a utopian ideal. This is the time of the romantics, the romantic poets. Photography is just beginning around this time and just after, and film follows very soon after that. The first anesthetic was used in 1846, the year of Neptune's discovery. I think that's my favorite correspondence. If we think about the way that we are in so many ways anesthetized these days, the beginning of that whole process. Also, the word hypnosis was coined in the year 1846. Hypnosis and hypnotherapy was born around this time. And, we can see that on so many levels, how that might be a Neptunian shift in our consciousness. We could, in some ways, link a lot of this back to the link with the East and those ideas and understandings. It's also a time of where really the drug manipulation by Western governments begins. It's the time of the Opium Wars, when the opium was thrust upon the Chinese to boost trade. They tried to drug a whole nation to boost the trade. And of course, that goes on, doesn't it? Of course, we could look at that in Afghanistan and the opium trade there, and look at how the peddling of drugs and we could see it on other levels as well, through the media, through the so many ways in which we are sort of manipulated and anesthetized in some way from what's actually going on. Very different energy to Uranus, where it's all about waking up, being alert, being awake, that quest for the truth. With Neptune, we want to just dissolve into the mystery. The Neptune return cycle is 165 years. We've just had our Neptune return last year. Neptune was at 26 degrees of Aquarius in an exact conjunction with Saturn when it was discovered. It took Saturn to actually bring Neptune to ground the discovery. And we had our Neptune return. So we're living through a Neptune return. This is a major thing, a major event. And in the years just after Neptune's discovery, Neptune entered Pisces. And that's where we are now. This is a virtual reality machine, which I think is a great symbol for Neptune in Pisces. Maybe we'll all be walking around with those on our heads to try not to really see what's going on. How else might it manifest? Well, that's not very good either, is it? The Prozac generation. I think we're already in it. Tsunami. This is an incredible picture of the tsunami. Maybe it's a generation. We might, you might expect that with Neptune in Pisces to see more of this. But it could also be an era of forgiveness and compassion. The melting of boundaries, the dissolving of the harshness. Neptune dissolves the harshness between people. It's like we can come to understand ourselves. We can transcend our differences with Neptune. So Neptune's in its own sign. This is the extraordinary thing. Neptune is in the sign that astrologers decided Neptune was the ruler of Pisces. Okay, Pisces was traditionally ruled by Jupiter. Modern astrologers, now most modern astrologers, will attribute Neptune at the very least as a co-ruler of Pisces. So Neptune's in its own sign for the first time since just after its discovery, when so much was changing in a Neptunian way. Here we are, Neptune now in its dignity, in its glory, through its own sign. And for the next 14 years. Pluto, discovered in 1930 by Percival Lowell. He discovered it, he posited where it was, and then it was actually observed first by Clyde Tombaugh. Tiny planet. Not even a planet now, of course. Scientists have downgraded Pluto to a dwarf planet. Still doesn't make a blind bit of difference for astrologers. They couldn't care less that astronomers have demoted it. In fact, they might argue that the demoting of it is symbolic and significant in itself, seeing as Pluto represents the shadow, as I'll talk about in a minute. Pluto is the god of the underworld, Hades in the Greek tradition. This is the abduction of Persephone, the most famous story of Hades. And this is the pomegranate, of course, the secret fruit that Persephone partakes of in the underworld, which ties her forever to the underworld and to the Dark Lord. So she's only allowed to come back for part of the year, and then she must return for the rest of the year, having tasted of the secret fruit. Knowing the secrets of the underworld means that she's bound there, bound to it. So she goes from the innocent core, playing in the field, to the experienced dark goddess, Persephone. We could see Pluto as Kali. Again, the power of the dark feminine expressed here. She is dancing on the body of Shiva, with all the heads, decapitated heads that she wears as a necklace. Pluto is, although it's a male figure in the myth, we could definitely think of Pluto as a female energy as well, a chthonic, deeply chthonic energy coming up from the bowels of the earth. We could also see Pluto as Dionysus, and many do. The will to power, Nietzsche talked about, pleasure and excess. Completely uncompromising in that desire for power. Do as thou wilt, as Crowley said. Carries that Dionysian quality about it. So what was going on around this time, and really in the time afterwards, the most compelling, surely, is the splitting of the atom. Just a few months after the discovery of Pluto, the atom is split. Such a symbolic moment, such a plutonic moment, the creation of plutonium that comes from that. The devastation that the plutonic can wreak, the havoc it can wreak on the world. Massive empowerment of the modern industry and the military. We can see that really coming out from around this time and in the time since. The rise of fascism in the 30s, the Holocaust, these are plutonic cultural resonances with again, the discovery of Pluto, of course, isn't causing this, but it is reflecting it culturally, the fact that we have named a planet after the god of the underworld. We have to then deal with our own underworld, our most destructive side, our darkest and most destructive side. It's also the beginnings of the sexual revolution, which we would certainly associate with Pluto. In fact, the term sexual revolution, which was coined by Wilhelm Reich, who believed that it was all about expressing your sexuality, and that was the epitome. That was the road to liberation, and he coined this term sexual revolution. I think it was actually in 1930 that he coined that term. The rise of feminism, the role of women in society, this fundamentally shifted and changed, put us in touch with a whole other aspect of ourselves, and originally drawn from deep, the desire to overthrow this male hierarchical system that we've been subjected to for so long. Suddenly, the whole fabric of a male-oriented society is challenged. We could debate how effectively it's been challenged, but nonetheless, we can see it in the urge. Developments in depth psychology, Freud and Jung, and their impact on our understanding of the psyche and our own depth. Pluto is about our own depth. Ultimately, it's about our healing. Pluto carries the power of healing, but it's like the homeopathic idea that the healing is in the poison. Pluto said, Jung said, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Jung's passion one of his passions was the owning of our own shadow, the realization and the acknowledgement and the honoring of our own shadow and the recognition of it. That was the way forward. Because he also said that the shadow is 90% pure gold. But until we address the shadow, we can't get anywhere near the gold. Pluto actually means wealth. That's what the word Pluto means. But it's that deep hidden wealth. It's like buried treasure. It's the treasure you have to mine deeply for. So here we end up with these three new, modern, transpersonal archetypes that challenge Saturn's authority. Uranus, radical awakening, breaking with tradition, innovation and creativity. And all that goes with that, all the responsibility that goes with that as well. You know, we carry Uranian energy now. As a collective, we carry it in our own lives. We can impact the world for good or evil, you know, so easily now, almost at the touch of a button. The power of our creativity, and Prometheus, Uranus gives us that, metaphorically gives us that power and responsibility. Neptune, transcending time and form, dissolving boundary, unifying, merging, manipulating, bliss-inducing. Pluto, the will to power, destroying the compelling power of Mother Nature and the embodiment of the shadow. We can see this in the Earth changes maybe as well. Pluto has a 248-year cycle. So we're nowhere near our Pluto return. But when it was discovered in 1930, it was in a very powerful configuration. It was opposite Saturn and square Uranus. Now, if any of you are astrologers here, you'll notice that this is very similar to what we were experiencing last year and this year, which is what I'm going to come on to next. But let's just consider Pluto in Capricorn. Capricorn represents the corporate energy, the order, the old order, the system. Pluto is the power of that, but also the potential destruction of that as well. And we're seeing it, aren't we, all the time, the challenge to this corporate structure. And here's one you'll like. And a lot more to come, I'm absolutely certain of it. It's the tip of the iceberg. But a nice tip. Yeah. This is what all the fuss is about. The Uranus-Pluto square. This is what we're experiencing at the moment. Uranus and Pluto don't make significant aspects very often because they're slow-moving planets. But this is, at the moment, they're making a 90-degree aspect to one another on what we call the cardinal cross, the 4 cardinal signs, which I'll just show you here. Aries, Libra, Cancer, Capricorn, the cardinal cross, the most powerful cross in astrology. When planets line up on the cardinal cross, we take them more seriously because they make things change, they make things happen. Cardinality creates change, it generates things, it initiates change. It can move mountains when you've got big alignments on this cross. So here we have the Uranus-Pluto square. It's active within a 5-degree orb between 2010 and 2018. Last year was when we were really exploring it, and we had the famous Grand Cross last summer. And it's in the 1-degree orb, really, only from this year through to 2015. As I say, it doesn't make an aspect very often. The cycle is 145 years. That's from one Pluto-Uranus conjunction to another. Now, if we take on the idea that these, and you can look at it both ways, but if you take on the idea that these planets really come into, so when they penetrate our consciousness, that's when they become important, then we could say that since the discovery of Pluto, that's when we need to really look at the Pluto aspects. This is the first major contact since the conjunction, the only conjunction since its discovery, in Virgo in the mid-1960s. Uranus and Pluto made a conjunction in Virgo in the 1960s. This is the ask any astrologer, they will tell you that this is the symbol of the 60s, that revolutionary time of social, political, cultural, sexual change, transformation. What we're experiencing now is the first major aspect since then, and it's a square. And the square is where things are forced to change. The seed is sown at the conjunction, and things are forced to change at the square. This is the first square following a conjunction that we've experienced. The last square was on the discovery of Pluto. The last time these two were square was just after the discovery of Pluto. We're now looking at the second square, the first one since the time of the discovery, and the first one since the conjunction. So that seed of revolution sown in the 60s is now expressing itself on the cardinal cross. Where it was when Pluto was discovered, that was also a cardinal alignment. It's expressing its potential with full force. And it's just beginning. We haven't actually had the conjunction yet. They haven't actually made an exact conjunction yet. This is just what I mean. It's the tip of the iceberg. We're just sort of beginning to touch it. They're 1 degree. They get to within 1 degree this year. They don't make the actual conjunction until next year. So what are the themes of a Uranus-Pluto cycle? Well, revolution and transformation, you might expect. Massive cultural shift. Unprecedented, really, I think. We didn't have to deal with Pluto before. Now we do. The stirring of turbulent undercurrents. The awakening of the collective shadow. We're certainly seeing that. The admitting of it, the bringing it out into the open. And also the most extreme expression of it as well, I think. Uranus-Pluto transforms the zeitgeist of an era as it did in the 60s, and it is doing now. But it's doing it now in a highly charged way as the two planets are at their most confrontational in the square. They're literally squaring up to each other, these two mighty forces that reside in the collective and in our unconscious in many ways. Prometheus liberates Dionysus, the will to power. So we see more extreme. We get more extreme happenings in our news on a day-to-day basis. And I think the acceleration of that is another feature. As the conjunction, as the square lines up, we're going to see an acceleration of this. The eruption of deep-rooted instincts. Iconoclasm on a grand scale, the breaking of the old, the throwing out of the old. We could see this maybe with religion. The breaking up of religions on a grand scale. The championing of reason, I think, as well. But also, we could also see cultic behavior on an unprecedented scale as well at the same time. This was a T-square. Just like on the Discovery, around the time of the Discovery, on the Discovery chart, we also have Saturn here as well. Saturn's in Libra at the moment, and last year made an exact T-square with Jupiter. Jupiter was involved as well last year. I mean, some of you will remember this incredible lineup. We had Jupiter in conjunction to Uranus, opposite Saturn, square Pluto. But Saturn has come retrograde this year back to make this lineup again, and on the 1st of July, which was a solar eclipse, we got this. The sun and the moon making their new moon solar eclipse alignment in a perfect, within about 4 degrees of orb, making what's called the Grand Cross, the most powerful figure you can have astrologically. This was the 1st of July. And this is the actual chart for it. It's a bit more complicated with all the other aspects of the other planets in there, but this also, what was significant about this solar eclipse was that it was the beginning of a new Saros cycle. Now, a Saros cycle of eclipses lasts for about 1,300 years. Every 18 years, each eclipse is part of a pattern of a number of eclipses over a long period of time. And they always begin either at the South Pole or the North Pole, and they gradually become more total. And in about 650 years, this eclipse, which was born on the 1st of July, will reach its epitome, and it will be a total eclipse. And then it will gradually wane, and it will disappear, this particular cycle in 3,331. But its birth was this July. There won't be another one born out of the South Pole for another 25 years. Every 18 years, you'll get another round of this eclipse, and gradually it will get closer and closer. But you always look at the birth chart of a new Saros cycle, and the birth chart is so immense. This chart I've just shown you, such an immense chart, was the birth of this cycle. So this Saros cycle is carrying us through 2012, through these times, charged up with that energy. So even though you couldn't see the eclipse very well, we tried upon the tour, it was impossible, you couldn't see anything. It was so partial. It's the most partial you can get for an eclipse because it's a new one. But something began, a seed was sown there as well, so it was very significant. I'm only going to put one chart up. It's just irresistible. This is the UK chart, drawn up for midday, for noon, which was the traditional time when an emperor or a king was always crowned or inaugurated at noon, with the sun on the midheaven. And look where it is. It's at 8 degrees of Capricorn. That's exactly where Pluto is. This is the most, if we think about Britain and when Britain began as an entity, we think of it as being William the Conqueror and 1066 and all of that. And here we have a chart which I've always sensed that Britain was at the heart of this whole change that we're going through, and here, real astrological confirmation. Pluto and the Grand Cross hits perfectly on this chart. Thanks. I just want to just finish really by saying something about the discovery of Chiron, because we've talked about the outer planets, the planets beyond Saturn, that take us beyond ourselves. And then this insignificant little rock was discovered in 1977. Insignificant rocks are discovered all the time. But for some reason, this one caught hold immediately in the astrological imagination. Probably because it was called Chiron, one of the most compelling figures, but somehow it came to represent something. One of the fascinating things about it is that its orbit, you can see its orbit there on the right, goes between Saturn. Sometimes it's closer to us than Saturn, sometimes it's further away than Uranus. It's a bridge between worlds. Chiron is known as the wounded healer. Chiron carried an incurable wound with him all his life. And it was because it was incurable, because it was a divine wound, he had to keep focusing on it, and he became the great healer that he was because he had to deal with his own wound, just as we have to deal with our own wound. Chiron has also been called the Rainbow Bridge by Barbara Han-Clow, and it's a lovely image here. And I think the bridge, Chiron is all about the bridge. Maybe it's a bridge back, a bridge between the personal and the transpersonal. Maybe it carries that bridge. If you think about its discovery, it coincided with a huge rise in complementary medicine and healing. Contemporary shamanism really came to the fore with Chiron's discovery. And I think a very significant one was the growth of the men's movement. Men trying to rediscover who they were in the face of a culture turned upside down. And the men's movement was all about the wound. It was all about touching the wound in the male, in the history of the male species and so on. And the deep ecology movement and the realization of Lovelock's Gaia was also around this time. And here you've got, this Chiron bringing us back. Maybe it's a 51-year cycle. So many of us, I haven't had it yet quite, but many people in the room here you'll have had your Chiron return, and it taps that wound that you carried from birth and carry all your life. It's in Pisces. I haven't really got time to talk about what that means, but it's with Neptune, close to Neptune at the moment. There was a conjunction of the two last year. And maybe it's a bridge back to the chronocratus, back to the authority of Jupiter and Saturn, the traditional authority. And maybe it's a bridge back to the earth, to our caring for the earth, that life isn't out there. For all the insight and for all the knowledge that we've acquired by going out beyond the bounds of the chronocratus, we have to come back to the earth and honor and love the earth. And this is our place. This is where we live. We don't live anywhere else. We live on the earth. And there's a profound wisdom in that, of course. But at the same time, with the knowledge that we have in our insatiable desire to know truth, to know the answer, we keep looking to the stars, we keep looking out. And we can look out to the center of the galaxy and wonder at it, and wonder how the Mayans knew where it was, and wonder about these times that we're living through and where we're going. This is just a bit of a joke. I've just put this up this is the chart for the 22nd of December 2012. Looks all right to me. I don't think it's all going to end on the 21st of December. In fact, I'm so confident about it that I'm running a course here in Glastonbury. There you go. There's a confident astrologer. That's a good shout, isn't it? So there we are. So that's the end of my talk. I hope you found that interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John Wadsworth. Thank you. Brilliant. Brilliant stuff. And do talk to John and indeed to her.